On today's agenda, we have an informal hearing at the Foreign Policy and EU Policy Committee with the Swedish ambassador to Italy regarding the priorities of the Swedish presidency of the Council. And I refrained from saying your name, sir, because it's very complicated for me. And does my colleague, Mr. Giulio Vigna, wish to add something, or can we immediately give the floor to the ambassador? Well, I do have a few remarks, but I will save them for later. Mr. Ambassador, over to you.
Okay, grazie signor Presidente. Mi chiamo Jan Björklund.
My name is Björklund. I'm a Swedish ambassador. It is for me a great honor.
I'd like to share with you the point of view of Sweden regarding the work to be conducted within the European Union over the next 6 months. I am studying Italian, but my spoken Italian isn't good enough yet, and therefore I'll continue in English.
Gentlemen, the challenges for Europe are bigger than in a long time. But these challenges has also meant that the EU members have come together on important issues. Suddenly we notice that Europe can be strong when we are united. Of course we knew that from before, but after a couple of crises we almost had forgotten how important our cooperation is. The trust between people and governments in Europe have increased the last year. That is important, not only for the policy on the war, but it can and should be used for solving other problems as well, to push new energy into old problems. I'm very happy to say that we have a very good dialogue between Italy and Sweden. I will today also be honest on some points where I think we disagree with each other. We have different views, but my point is that good friends can both disagree in the beginning, but after the discussion we can make compromises. Because we know that the common cooperation is more important than differences on the issues. Minister of European Affairs of Italy, Raffaele Fitto, visited his colleague in Stockholm already 2 weeks ago. And Prime Minister Meloni will visit the Prime Minister Kristersson in Stockholm next Friday. And I myself have already had several meetings this January with government officials here in Rome on important topics. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Presidents, let me list the biggest challenges we meet in Europe today. First, the war in Europe. Let us not forget that while we are sitting here during this hour, people die on the battlefield. What we witness is a horror. Putin bombs civilians deliberately to create fear. These brave Ukrainians defend not only themselves, but also us, our freedom and our democracy. Russian aggression must not pay off. The invasion is unprovoked, it's unacceptable, and it's illegal. Those responsible for war crimes have to be held accountable. Europe, together with our American partner, have helped and have to continue to help Ukraine in its struggle. The help is financial, it is humanitarian, but it is also weapons and armaments and sanctions on Russia. To send weapons are sometimes controversial. Some say, why should we give them weapons? If we don't, we will force them to negotiate instead. But let one thing be very clear. If we stop sending weapons, we don't force both sides to stop the war. Only Ukraine will have a lack of armament. Russia can, of course, continue the war. The immediate effect of stop sending weapons is that Ukraine will not be able to defend themselves, but nothing will stop Russia from continuing the aggression. It has been said before, but I will say it again. If Russia stops shooting, there will be no more war. But if Ukraine stops shooting, it will be no more Ukraine. And I think we should understand one thing. If Russia wins this war, or they can claim that they win this war, we will live in a more dangerous Europe, because Putin's goal is not Donbass. His goal is to reshape the Soviet Union and a new Russian empire. Sweden has not been to war for more than 200 years. We are a very peaceful country, but we are not pacifistic. We have always taken security and defense very seriously. This is the first and most important Swedish priority during our presidency: European security and freedom for Ukraine. Second challenge, European competitiveness. A couple of generations ago, European companies competed with each other. Then, during the 20th century, we have been used to tough competition from North America. And now, in the 21st century, we are also facing a tough competition from Asia, and China, and India. We are glad that people in Asia are getting higher living standard. We want that for them. But it is our responsibility to ensure that also Europe is competitive. For jobs and welfare in Europe, for us, for our children, and for generations to come. Competitiveness is created out of business-friendly climate, with creative innovation and research, reasonable taxes on companies, little bureaucracy, little regulations, and good education. Competitiveness has very seldom been achieved through government intervention. It is the free market economy and free trade which has been success factors for Europe. In a letter to the EU Commission just before Christmas in December, the Swedish government, together with other governments in several other EU countries, argued for being careful now to introduce more flexible rules on state aid. I understand that different countries can argue in other ways, and at the end of the day we have to find compromises. But let me explain why we want to be cautious on these matters. Let me just point at two risks with much more flexibility on state aid. Let's say that there is a company in a country, let's say Italy, a company which is very successful, it's very competitive. But there is a similar company in another country who have not so high quality, they are not so competitive. But the government in that country gives a lot of state aid to that company. So at the end of the day, they will win the competition. Is that good? Is that fair? We don't think so. European competitiveness has to be built on supporting the most competitive companies, not to subsidize those who lack competitiveness. That's why we should be very, very careful here when we now if we now want to open for more state aid. Then, of course, the obvious risk that governments with a lot of money in their pocket can spend a lot to subsidize their companies, while other countries can't afford that. And there are already a lot of European funds which not are used. Maybe it is possible to argue that we should use the existing money and the existing funds before we start new funds. However, and I want to underline that, we have to meet the American IRA initiative in some way in Europe. And Sweden realizes that other countries have other views and perspectives than we have, and so we have to compromise and find common solutions. While we can argue on the means, we can, though, agree on that strengthened European competitiveness is one of the most important priorities this year. Number 3, the green transition. This winter, many ski resorts have had to close. The news about both droughts and floods is becoming more common, and in the long run, stopping global warming is a matter of survival. The plan to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 is vital to reach the CO2 neutrality by 2050 and to live up to the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. We have already set up ambitious goals and rules for reducing emissions. It's now of greatest importance that not only discuss new goals, but to implement those which has already taken. The Swedish presidency intends to do its part to strengthen the EU as a front runner in the green transition. Number 4, democracy and rules of law. The core of our union is our shared fundamental values. The liberal social model based on freedom, democracy, the principle of rule of law, and individual rights. On these points, there is no room for compromise. The union must always work against authoritarian governance. This is exactly the reason why our union was founded from the beginning. 5th, migration. The lack of common migration policy within our union is not because we don't want to have a common policy. I think everybody understands that it would be better with common policy when it comes to migration. But it is because that it has been hard to agree on difficult problems. But I want to thank Italy today for having pushed the migration issue up to the top of the agenda once again. And now it's time to take some steps forward. The international law make a difference between real refugees and, on the other side, economic migrants. In reality, it's difficult to separate them, but the most important solution is that we have to try. Those who not have real refugee reasons for coming to Europe should return, or in the best case, never try to cross the Mediterranean. We all understand that a basic fundament for sending migrants back is cooperation with North Africa. Let's try to restart discussions with these countries about agreement on these issues. But let us also realize that agreements with North Africa demands broader cooperation than only returning migrants. We should also strengthen the European border surveillance, the Frontex. If we want to have open borders, we must also, as far as possible, have a common view on migration. We must take more joint responsibility for migration. Mr. President, one presidency is not enough to make a big change, but our goal is to make Europe a little bit more safer, greener, and freer. We Europeans, we can when we want to. The European Union was not created because we always agree on each other. On the contrary, the Union exists because we often think differently. The Union is a method of dealing with these disagreements through dialogue and compromise. We want to resolve our conflicts at the negotiation table, not on the battlefield as in the past. We Europeans have learned the hard way over many generations that we are weak when we are divided, but when we are united, we are strong. And this is the very, very most important core of our union. We are stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And we have a very first request for the floor by Mr. Amendola. Thank you, President. Thank you, President Tremonti. Thank you, President Gilavigna. I wish to greet the ambassador and wishing you all the best for this very important semester, this very challenging semester to both you and to your recently elected government. I have a question regarding point 2, competitiveness. because I think that is at the very core of the upcoming Council of Europe, or the European Council rather, and it is at the core of the choices we have to make. You were mentioning remarks on the state aid that I agree with. In other words, an endless waiver on rules pertaining to state aid would create an imbalance on the internal market, and it would imbalance competitiveness. And of course, we have data referring to the fiscal capacities of certain governments who can obtain advantages, or rather than advantages, they are a way of standing fast, and they are a waiver to the internal competitiveness rules. But our problem, Mr. Ambassador, refers to international competitiveness, because among the 27 members of the EU, we can solve our issues. But both the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the Climate Act and Made in China 2025, which is equal to state aid for a global player such as China, are already leading to a diversification of the inputs that these two giants are doing to support their industries, which means that we too are facing an imbalance on the global market. Of course, we are impressed by what the US has done, because of course we have a common balance. So of course the problem can't be solved with an endless waiver to rules pertaining to state aid. But the Commission's idea, and this was an idea that the President of the Council of Europe mentioned in a recent interview, that a European fund that can support our industry can be important. The green transition, as you were mentioning, isn't just a way to save Europe, but it's also a way to revamp Europe and the European market. And of course, we're disadvantaged when it comes to raw materials. And of course, we're very glad that Sweden has recently discovered some new resources. But of course, as far as the green transition is concerned, Europe isn't in the front line. And therefore, competitiveness and reaching the goals of the digital and green transition wouldn't be reachable simply with the current fiscal capacity that the 27 member states, either alone or together. Therefore, moving on to my specific question, during your mandate, the Sweden will have to deal with two important topics. The first is a common European instrument that can support a European industrial plan or an industrial capacity that can lead to advantages above and beyond our rules pertaining to state aid. In other words, we need to have a common capacity for European industry to rise up to the challenges it faces. The second point, which is also linked to competitiveness, during the Swedish semester, there will be a discussion on the Stability and Growth Pact as well. And the Commission has submitted a proposal, especially regarding debt. And from this point of view, I'd like to understand what the Swedish presidency's sentiment is. Is it favorable to the reform by 2023, based on the Commission's indications, especially when it comes to the targets pertaining to reducing debt within the framework of the pact itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that important question. There are two ways of answering the question. The first one is that the presidency always are responsible for reaching compromises. Now, but I also want to argue for the basic Swedish point of view, and then of course we have to find compromises. Let me take an example from my own country. In the 1970s and 1980s, we had a lot of state aid in Sweden. But and I have also been a politician before, so I know exactly how at least we politicians in Sweden, how we work. And, you know, it's much more easy to give state aid to companies which are in problems, because everybody will argue for help them. If we help them, they will survive and can invest in the future. Those who are real competitive they often they don't need state aid, and they are very, very competitive on their own. So I remember when we supported a lot of different factories, textile industry in my own region where I lived, when the aid was finished, they were out of business. They were not competitive, but we helped them. So when we argue for state aid for strength and competitiveness, it's very important how it is really form this state aid, not only put money into business who have difficulties. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing, but we have to find compromises, but the Swedish basic standpoint is that it's very problematic with state aid. In 1990s, we took away almost all state aid in Sweden. We did big reforms. Today, Sweden is number one when it comes to innovation in Europe. So I think it's, and that is, it has a connection. Instead of lowering taxation on companies and so on, general rules instead of doing specific in state investments in companies. But we need to find solutions. I agree on the problem you mentioned, that the IRA needs some sort of response now, absolutely. The second thing I would argue is that if we want to invest more in green transition, we already have funds for that. The Next Generation EU, in Italy called PNRR, have a lot of investment money possible to invest in green transition. However, in all countries, in several countries, countries have difficulties to use all this money. So maybe we should start there. But let me underline that we have to find compromises now. We have to meet this transition. But the basic Swedish standpoint from the beginning is that we are rather reluctant with increasing state aid, because for ourselves it has never been successful. But I know there are other standpoints in Europe, and we have to find compromises, of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Ambassador, your summary was very interesting because you underscored 4 points: security, competitiveness, democratic values, and the green transition. Now, I won't be mentioning things that have already been underscored by Mr. Amendola, who focused on competitiveness. Let me ask you an opinion regarding your government's political vision during its presidency of the European Union regarding a topic which has led to a certain degree of concern in Italy. I'm referring to the environmental transition and the approach regarding the energy performance of buildings. Homes, therefore. Of course, Europe has many differences in terms of its construction, and there are very many differences in terms of costs and in terms of the timeline needed. But of course, we have to understand what direction Sweden wishes to give to these discussions. Of course, we appreciate the level of energy performance reached by many countries in Europe, including Sweden, but of course, we need to be aware of the costs which would be required in countries that have different histories in terms of their building heritage. And of course, the European Union has to make resources available so that all countries can be on the same level. And therefore, I'd like to hear your opinion on this point. And finally, before I conclude, I'd like to ask you, what is Sweden's approach regarding an issue which we haven't solved for many years now, namely illegal migration along the Mediterranean route? Of course, there is a responsibility on the part of those countries whose flags are flown by those vessels that rescue migrants in the Mediterranean Sea, although these are non-governmental organizations. And therefore, what responsibility do those countries have in terms of these vessels that rescue migrants at sea?
Thank you very much for the important questions. Let me start with migration. First of all, we have to have a system in Europe where we take a joint responsibility for the migrants. It cannot only be up to some few countries, for example, the Mediterranean countries. Absolutely. Secondly, the illegal migrants should be sent back. But when we have said that, we have to understand that we need agreements with those countries which should receive them back. And first of all, the North African countries, and we all know the situation in Libya is complicated, but in other countries. So we need agreements, and we want to from the Swedish side, from the Swedish Presidency, we want to now take initiative that the EU could restart discussions with the North African countries with this agreement, because we can all agree on that illegal migrants, they are here illegally, they should not be here, but to solve that we have to send them back, and that needs cooperation with those countries. So, and the agreements with these countries are very important. When it comes to these ships, the NGO ships, as I understand it, the EU has no position on this. We have international conventions, and Italy has now implemented new rules, but we have international conventions, and they should be, of course, followed. I know there is disagreement how to interpret these conventions, but the EU has no standpoint. They are international conventions, they have to be followed, and you have, from Italy's side, now implemented new regulations for this, so let's take it from there. Well, the energy costs is, of course, a problem for all of us, and if you think it's cold in Rome right now, you should try Sweden. It's 10 degrees now in Stockholm, and energy costs are a problem everywhere. It's increasing everywhere. So I think it was an Italian initiative, this price cap now come from both from oil and gas, and maybe that will reduce some. But I am afraid that this winter, all families, all businesses will have problems with the energy costs. I should say, though, I am impressed by Italy, how quick it has been possible to change from Russian gas to North African gas. That process has been very, very fast, and it has been a lot of determination, a strong determination, both from the previous Italian government and the present Italian government to do this change, and that is important, I think, for the future. Thank you.
Sì, grazie Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. I, too, would like to go back to the topic of state aid to ask you, how can this topic be integrated with that of the so-called European champions? In other words, those companies that have to be safeguarded on the European level. Because earlier we were discussing the possibility of creating a fund, but of course we have to keep in mind that some states, when it comes to European aid, and I'm referring to Italy, of course, have a lower level of capacity, a lower level of liquidity, as Mr. Amendola was saying. You remember that a few years ago, we were discussing the same topic regarding the de minimis issue to raise the level to 200,000 euros, which, of course, on the topic of competitiveness would have allowed some players to have greater capacities. So, you know that there is the issue of European champions, so to speak, which emerged after the pandemic. In other words, we have to be able to protect certain strategic European types of production. So we have to consider how these two topics can be combined. And I have two other very quick questions for you on migration. Firstly, how do you intend to interact with the Visegrad group, which was the real obstacle in the past in terms of negotiating regarding the Dublin regulation? And secondly, regarding the issue of energy performance is concerned, I too feel that this can be a real problem for some countries. And therefore, do you think there can be some kind of significant support regarding these types of investments? Because this was mentioned for the Juncker plan, which then became InvestEU. And this could have been a way of offering some kind of economic support to countries and those subjects which have the need to make that kind of investment.
Thank you very much for the questions. Well, we fully agree that even if we, from my country, we very much believe in free trade. So you are, of course, right that there are some strategic areas where the answer cannot only be free trade. For example, we have all in Europe now more or less decided that it's not appropriate to have big Chinese government-run companies into the telecom sector, for example. That is, of course, an exception from the free trade idea, but it is necessary of security reasons. We also have these strategic metals. It was mentioned by, I think, Mr. Amendole, that we have recently discovered a very huge source of strategic metals in the mountains in the northernmost part of Sweden for producing semiconductors in Europe and so on. But we have been too dependent, mostly on China, but on Asia, when it comes to strategic metals. And we have, and also these semiconductors and other products, where we have to take into consideration strategic interest for Europe. So even if our general view is free trade, there is exceptions of strategic reasons. We cannot, but we have to be cautious with defining everything as strategic interests. So the free trade is the basic idea, though. Well, the Visegrad Group, of course, there are some Central European countries who have been very, very reluctant on when it comes to the migration pact. So we have to work. Sweden basically have the same view as Italy. We should have some sort of system in Europe where we agree on distribute those who are legal immigrants, not the illegal, but the legal immigrants, how we redistribute them in Europe. And there are some countries blocking that. So we have to continue that discussion. There is no way formally to force them. We have to do agreements. That's the idea of the, as you know, in the European world. So we have the same view as you have on that. Thank you.
Calovini.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us today and for making yourself available to illustrate the 5 fundamental points as far as the Swedish presidency of the semester is concerned. I'll keep my remarks very brief. Thank you very much for what you said regarding competitiveness and also regarding democracy and rights, which of course is a fundamental topic, one we always have to keep in mind. Thank you for making your comments regarding migration, in which you underscored your willingness to cooperate with a country like Italy, which of course is always in the front line as far as migration is concerned. I have questions regarding the 2 other points you raised. First of all, on the war in Europe. Without going into the details regarding Sweden joining NATO, because this is in the right context to deal with that, but also given Ankara's decision to block negotiations, which I'm critical of, I'm wondering whether or not the Swedish government, given its presidency, may possibly consider Europe equipping itself with an army or with a common defense policy. In other words, since some NATO countries and some European NATO members cannot participate in common actions, do you think the topic of creating a European army would make sense? The second question is on the topic of the transition, the green energy transition, which I was discussing with other colleagues earlier. Now, Sweden has always been very sensitive regarding environmental issues, and rightfully so, especially in this moment in time. Of course, we are all aware of the difficulties and the effects of the energy transition. But I was wondering, do you think that in Europe, maybe even in Sweden, do you think there has been a sort of ideological environmentalism in recent years? And let me just mention the fact that a few days ago, we met with a U.S. representative who was mentioning that the electrical panels that all our car manufacturers are equipping themselves with are often manufactured in China with the exploitation of religious minorities. Therefore, do you think there can be an ideological side to environmentalism, which at the same time leads us to ignore human rights issues?
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, the security. Yes, Sweden, after 200 years of neutrality, Sweden has decided to apply for NATO membership. And it's, of course, the Russian behavior which is the background for that decision. And now it's a very broad support in Sweden for that decision. We are really optimistic that we of course, we have discussions with Turkey and so on. We are really optimistic that at the end of the day we will be members, but it will take some more discussions, I believe. European defense, when you say the word European defense, it's always a question how you define it and what you mean. if we mean that we should cooperate between our defenses in Europe, defense industry, we are all in favor of it, and we already do. The Swedish company Saab, which is our equivalent of Leonardo, works together with Leonardo every day. And we have common, now we send, well, equipment to Ukraine together. We do it all the time. I don't for a moment think that Italy believes that, but there are some politicians in Europe sometimes, when they say European defense, sometimes means that we should in the long run replace NATO with the EU defense, and that is not our goal. NATO is very, very important. The American security guarantees for Europe is very, very important. So even if we cooperate within Europe, we never want to see that as an alternative to NATO, it's a complement to NATO. Well, ideological, of course it depends on what your own ideology is. Let's say like this, even if everyone agree on the climate change and that is a threat, I know somebody doesn't, but if we agree on that, there is of course a very big ideological view, for example, on the use of nuclear power, for example, and that is very ideological from some sides. So there are, of course, ideological blockings in several questions in the the green policy, as in other policies. For Sweden, I can say for us, we had a referendum on this is not, every country decide for themselves what energy supply every country want to. I can say for Sweden, we have a referendum on nuclear, just like Italy had generations ago. And the people decided to keep the nuclear. Today we have 35–40% nuclear, and that means that we have never been dependent on Russian gas. We have never been dependent on gas at all, oil or coal. We have a total 100% fossil-free energy supply in Sweden because we use nuclear and renewables, a lot of hydropower and so on from the mountains. So, but every country has to decide their own energy policy, and of course this question is also ideological as many else questions.
Presidente Boldrini, in collegamento.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the ambassador for joining us today at this committee meeting. I have a specific question regarding the presence of the Kurdish community in Sweden. Now, we know that there is a large Kurdish community in your country, and we also know that in order for Sweden to join NATO, there have been some forms of conditioning by Turkey, which says it would be willing to agree on Sweden joining NATO only if some people who have found asylum in Sweden are extradited. And I'm referring to former members of the Kurdish Workers' Party movement. And 2 days ago, President Erdogan threatened that he would not support Sweden joining NATO due to the fact that some members of the Strandkort's extreme right party in Sweden who burned a copy of the Quran in front of the Turkish embassy in Stockholm. Therefore, I'd like to hear an update from the ambassador on how your government intends to deal with this very sensitive issue. Because on the one hand, you have the fact that you would have to comply with the international protection laws, and therefore refugees cannot be extradited. But on the other hand, you're also facing the blackmail by another state regarding Sweden joining NATO. Now, Sweden has already extradited a member of the PKK following Turkey's request for that person being extradited. And therefore, I would like to ask you whether Sweden intends to accept this blackmail, and if it will forego its decision to comply with the Geneva Convention of 1951, which is, of course, one of the pillars of the European family. And rules pertaining to asylum are present in all of the European Union's founding documents.
Thank you for that important question. Yes, Sweden has applied for NATO membership, and the background is, of course, the war and the security situation in our part of Europe. We have made an agreement between Sweden, Finland, and Turkey among a lot of issues, and we are determined to fulfill that agreement. We will respect, the Swedish government will always respect the rule of law and the rule of international convention, of course. The statement from the Turkish president 2 days ago was after an incident in Stockholm where a right-wing Protestant burned the Quran in front of the Turkish embassy. Let me say that I think that is a very disrespectful behavior. I think you shouldn't do things like that. You shouldn't do it with the Christian Bible, not with the Quran. But there is a freedom of speech in countries, and things happen. You don't like them, but they are allowed in a democracy. That we will not change that attitude at all from Sweden. But I can at the same time say that I think it's very disrespectful to do such a thing. But it's in a democracy, it's allowed to do also disrespectful things. So we will not change. We will not break any international convention. We will follow the laws, and we will fulfill the agreement we have between Sweden, Finland, and Turkey.
Scutella, grazie.
Thank you and good morning. I want to thank you, sir. I paid close attention to your remarks, especially regarding flows of migration, which is a very important topic. And as you yourself were saying, this is a topic which has to be dealt with through agreements within our community. In other words, no nation can deal with such a sensitive topic alone. And as far as this very sensitive topic is concerned, I'd like to hear your remarks regarding the words spoken by the Swedish ambassador to the European Union, who initially said that the Swedish presidency would not have dealt with this topic. And then later the ambassador said that he was misunderstood, and he clarified those statements. Now, you have already discussed this topic, and therefore your opinion seems to differ from those of your colleague. But just to clarify things, given the importance of this topic, I'd like to hear further remarks on this item from you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the statement from my colleague in Brussels was misunderstood. There are two dimensions, well, a lot of details in the migration question, lot of different questions, but there are two big dimensions in the EU process now. First of all, it's the external dimension. That means what do we do outside EU, in the Mediterranean, agreements with North Africa and so on. It's called the external dimension. Then it's the internal dimension. It's how do we deal with it when refugees are in Europe, how should we redistribute them and so on. So I think there is a common understanding now in the European Council between countries that we now, this semester, will deal with the external dimension first. The process is going on with the internal dimension as well, but the plan is to take up that for decisions next year, and that is a common understanding within the country. So we should now start dealing with the external dimension. That means Frontex in the Mediterranean, and then means starting discussion for North Africa. So that is the common agreement with the European states, and that is also the Swedish agenda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I have a more macro remark to make. But first of all, let me thank you for your remarks regarding the EU-NATO relation, because it isn't very common to hear a discussion, a very clear discussion on what the EU's role has to be and what NATO's role has to be. I fully agree with you. Our security architecture isn't simply the one pertaining to the EU. It is a Western security architecture that we have to defend, because it is the only way of protecting ourselves against the autocrats who are trying to impose another system upon the world. And that is the real challenge we face. In other words, we have to be able to promote human rights and the rule of law. We have to promote the model of our democracies against a model made up of social control and the pervasive presence of the state in the lives of individuals. And we have to go back to being proud of what we stand for. I think that is the real issue. Perhaps we have forgotten who we are, where we come from, and sometimes we're also confused as to which direction we're headed in. And therefore, our future has to begin from the reshoring of our industries, of our strategic productions, of the supply chains. And of course, it's great news that you discovered those rare earth elements in Kiruna. And it's also a good idea to think about how we can cooperate on the defense industry within Europe. But we don't have to act as Europeans against the US, but with the US. Because of course, the challenge we face is very broad, and therefore we have to find a unity within Europe and then work on uniting the West. I think that would be my message. We have a number of priorities, and I saw that you yourselves mentioned them. In terms of foreign policy, of course, we have to focus on cooperating with Africa based on agreements to lead to the repatriation of Africans to Africa. But of course, we have to have cooperation within the EU member states. What we've seen in recent years is an unprecedented penetration of China and Russia in Africa with unfair practices through corruption, through the use of so-called armies, and of course I'm referring to the Wagner Group in this case. But our democracies have to have the strength to say that our model offers a greater degree of freedom. That is the message we have to offer to each country in Africa through bilateral relations, but also as the European Union, perhaps with a dialogue to be fostered with the African Union. Thank you.
Well, I can only say that I agree on your remarks when it comes to the transatlantic how important the transatlantic cooperation is, and also that we have underestimated the cooperation between Europe and Africa, both for, well, the migrant question is just one of them, as you mentioned, also the strategic interest not to letting China take over Africa, of course, that is also important.
Vigna, Presidente, vuoi?
Sì, grazie Presidente Tremonti.
Thank you, Mr. Tremonti. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for having answered all of the questions to you so accurately. Going back to many of the things which were mentioned so far by my colleagues, Mr. Candiani mentioned the topic pertaining to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And I wish to refer to electrical cars, which is related to that topic. In Italy, and in southern or Mediterranean Europe more generally, there is a certain degree of concern regarding 2035 and 2030, within which we will have to achieve 50% electrical cars, or by 2030. We see a number of problems regarding our ability to achieve these targets. In other words, we would have to shift our labor force. We would have to convert our automotive enterprises and all companies related to the automotive industry, we would have to reconvert them in a very limited number of years. To us, there is a problem pertaining to how logical this decision would be on the European level, which is what our colleague from the Brothers of Italy party was saying earlier. It's a logical problem due to the fact that we have some countries who have a large portion of their energy which comes from renewables. Those who focus on nuclear power, like Sweden or France, exist, but there are a number of countries which still rely on coal very much. Think of Poland, which produces 70% of its power from coal, or Germany even. And therefore, perhaps we would be simply moving pollution from the city centers to the countryside or the more rural areas where these coal-powered plants are located. And then I'm simply shifting from the local view to the global view by saying that we would also be facing a geopolitical problem, which is what Mr. Formentini and other colleagues were mentioning. What I mean by that is that during the time it would take to build the gigafactories, which would take from 5 to 8 years' time, we would still have to buy batteries from China. And then, of course, we also know that the construction or the building, the production of those batteries still has an environmental impact. And still, once we build those gigafactories in Europe, the material we would require to produce those batteries would either be extracted in the People's Republic of China or in other countries which, as Mr. Formentini was saying earlier, are satellites, are Chinese satellites. And therefore, again, we would still be relying on another superpower. And we would simply be replicating the same mistake we made by relying on Russian gas. And maybe the European Commission, with this turbo green stance, may be relying a little bit too much on the idea that globalization is a perfect concept. But it seems to me that the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that globalization can only work in peaceful conditions globally. But as soon as we face a global crisis, manufacturers stop exporting abroad and decide to keep their production on the domestic level. And in March and April of 2020, in Italy, we couldn't find any face masks, for instance, to try to protect ourselves against COVID. And in 2035 or 2040, we wouldn't want to be left without batteries or without spare parts for our automotive industry. So this is something we're concerned with. And Mr. Ambassador, we're concerned with this on all levels, from the local level, when it comes to reconverting our businesses, to the European level, taking into account the environmental impact, all the way up to the global level. And then more specifically, as far as Italy is concerned, and I'm sure you're aware of this, there's a major debate regarding Nutri-Score and regarding the labeling of foods. And the more recent news regarding directives on labels on wine. In other words, anything which states whether or not a food product is good or bad for you based on certain parameters. Italian citizens and the Italian political scene sees this as an attack on Italy by the European Union. in a moment in time in which our country's idea is to push to revitalize made in Italy products. So these were the two comments I had wanted to share with you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that question. It was a lot of questions, so I think I focus on some of them. And of course, when you are describing the conflict between different goals, you are of course totally right. We want to achieve a lot of things at the same time, and sometimes they come into conflict with each other. When I visit your hometown, as I understand, Torino, I visited Stellantis or Fiat now 3 times during my time, but also because Sweden is also a car making and car producing nation. And I can see the car manufacturing in Europe have now taken a big step towards the electrical cars. There are no car company today who are planning that the next generation of cars should be driven by gas. They are all going to electrical cars or hybrid electrical cars. So I think the transition is already going on for this goal. 2030, the goal is to not sell new cars without electricity from 2030 or something. So not all cars, but the new cars should be driven by electricity in some way. And that is, as I can see it, we are on the way there. Now, on the other hand, you are of course quite right. It's no meaning to have electrical cars if the electricity is produced in fossil power plants. Coal or oil and gas and so on. So of course, at the same time, we have to change energy production in Europe, and we have a goal for 2050, so it's almost 30 years until that. And then of course the strategic questions on certain important products which we can't be totally dependent on when it comes to China, or we have to also produce it in Europe. I can tell you in Sweden now we have a conflict because when you discover a new mine with strategic metals, we have during the last 30 years implemented new laws and restrictions which make it very complicated to open a mine because of environmental reasons. So the environmental reasons and the climate reasons come into conflict with each other. So of course we now have to open these mines and produce it when we have these assets in Europe, of course. So, well, there are a lot of conflicts of goals, but as I can see it, the green transition is going on now, and I really could feel it when I visited Fiat in Torino. They are really into the next generation of cars there.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now, in Washington, D.C., at the National Archives, there is a quote by Shakespeare on the facade. And the interpreter apologizes, but it didn't quite get the quote. But it's also highlighted on the Swedish program, and it was also underscored by your remarks, and we'd be very grateful if you'd send us a copy of your speech, Mr. Ambassador. We, of course, have to have great perspectives for the future, but we also have to keep in mind our past in the Shakespearean sense of continuity. In 2003, in the second semester of the European presidency, it was Italy's semester. And whenever you have to draft an agenda, a program, you always have to try to introduce something new and interesting in your vision. And we had the idea of including Eurobonds in our program, which were inspired by the Union bonds, by Delors' Union bonds in the 1990s. But the Eurobonds were an Italian proposal. And these were Eurobonds for infrastructure, for industry, and especially for the military industry. I remember that there were very negative reactions to our proposal, mainly due to financial reasons. But there was also a very political reaction on the UK's side. The Chancellor said, that's nice, but the military industry is nation-building issue, so no thank you. And then, 20 years down the line, we now have Eurobonds, which means that the right ideas always face an uphill direction, but they still evolve. And now Eurobonds are part of our reality, and they finance an important European initiative. Europe is also headed towards a common defense. The European compass, as highlighted by the European Commission, well, you may say that the compass is a strange term, but it's a very typical one in European bureaucratic jargon, but we're now starting to talk about European defense, which is extraordinary, I think. In 1941, the ideological manifesto of our European fathers was the Ventotene Manifesto, and it was drafted when the German army was on the outskirts of Moscow. And they said that Europe will exist if it will have a common foreign policy and common security forces, a common army. So this is something which belongs to our common memory. And during that semester, we also had the German crisis, or in other words, the European Bank and the European Presidency wanted to impose sanctions on Germany and upon France. At the time, Germany was growing less than Italy, and its debt was growing more than Italy's debt. It sounds incredible, but that's exactly how things were at the time. And of course, imposing sanctions on Germany, as we've seen in history, doesn't bring luck. But the Italian presidency's objection was technical. In other words, these were sanctions on a country which wanted to increase its debt for very political reasons, not because it wasn't incapable of reducing it. Germany reacted very well. There were no sanctions. In fact, there were reforms, and there was a different industrial policy, which then led to years of excellent development and growth. I think this is the right time to think about the future of our industry very seriously. Can we be the only island in the world based on the free market alone when dealing with China and America, who have different industrial plans in mind? Or may we not perhaps discuss forms or ways to finance our industry? I think that is an essential question. And the discussion, which will be taking place during the Swedish presidency, will be very positive indeed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. And there will be I think we are in a very interesting and important phase in Europe right now. We maybe always are, but because the war have created some new unity and some new space and open doors for discussions. Now, let me start with common foreign policy, because we have discussed common foreign policy for, well, 30 years at least, maybe more in Europe, but it has always, but when it have come to very crucial points, for example, the Iraq war 20 years ago, the big powers of Europe took totally different standpoints, and common foreign policy was an illusion. And common foreign policy, and sometimes we have this, let's change the constitution so we have a qualified majority vote on foreign policy. Well, we agree from Sweden, we are open to do that, but common foreign policy is not constitutional aspects, it's if we share the values when it comes to the core issues. Now, the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the attack on Ukraine, has created common foreign policy in Europe. That is the important thing. It's not a constitutional question. It's when we have common values in important conflicts going on. That's common foreign policy, and we now have it. And now I think it's much more easy to change the constitution now if we want to, because now we trust each other on this question. And so that is it's these questions you raise, Mr. President, is from our point of view they are not constitutional. It is, can we agree on each other when it really happen difficult things? And now we have, and I think that so common foreign policy is in completely new space for discussion now. And when it comes to the support, government intervention in the business, well, as I said in my introduction, I think we have disagreements between our countries, but we have to find common solutions. And as I answered Mr. Amendola recently, I will say to you, we have to find compromises. We realize that. We are free traders, we are free market economy believers, but we have to find common solutions. Of course, we have to do that. No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Grazie a tutti.
Grazie ambasciatore.